Well, hello and welcome to Whistleblower Heroes, everyday heroes and educators sharing the information that you need to know here on Revolution Radio. And I'm your host, Ella. Well, what is a whistleblower? A whistleblower is a person who makes public disclosures of wrongdoing, corruption, and crime. These courageous people often suffer retaliatory actions because of their disclosures, but in the end, many of these people are often the catalyst for needed change and are eventually lauded as heroes. And I'm here to celebrate these heroes and give them a platform because shining a light on wrongdoing wherever it occurs plays an important role in keeping society peaceful, free, and just. And today with me, I'm going to be interviewing a journalist. And of course, journalists play a very important role in disclosure. So with me today, I have Mr. Winston Ross. Winston, are you there?
I'm here.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate that you're coming on and agreeing to an interview. And I also have my co-host with me, Mr. Donald Jeffries, the author of Hidden History. Hi, Donald.
Hi, Ella. How you doing?
It's nice to have you back again.
Nice to be back.
So Winston is a contributing writer at NEWSWEEK, and he covers national affairs, including culture, counterculture, technology, and politics, with a little international flavor mixed in. His specialties are writing, photography, investigative reporting, and a little movie and music editing. So again, Winston, I want to say thank you very much. And it looks like you attended the University of Missouri, Columbia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you want to add anything else to that?
In terms of education or skills or background, I can't really think of anything. I like to spend a lot of time outdoors, as we were just talking about.
Yeah, that's a great balance. There's the time to think and to work and to, get your head wrapped around politics in the world, and there's time just to be a part of the world and actually participate in it. And so
yeah, it's a
okay,
good way to step away from all of the rancor that has infiltrated the politics and government today.
Oh yeah, definitely. The reality TV show is what it seems like.
It is. It's like one bad reality TV show.
Mm-hmm. That's what it is. So I do tribute. So this is a tribute to you. So I'm very interested in maybe where you grew up, what shaped you, who were your influences as a child, and maybe your parents were influenced in your career choices. So I'd like to go back that far if you don't mind.
Sure. I grew up in Berkeley, California, and my parents actually were both journalists when they were younger. My mother worked for a newspaper down in Florida for some time, not long after she got out of school, and my dad worked for UPI, which is a wire service similar to the Associated Press. And by the time I was born, they had both gotten out of journalism for one reason or another. My dad, in particular, I remember, used to tell me that he found it very frustrating that you had to present both sides fairly. Like, he thought that was ridiculous, and that you should just be able to sort of say what you wanted as a journalist. And of course, as somebody who went to journalism school and was trained, classically, for lack of a better term, all we learned was the importance of that, of presenting both sides fairly. And now I feel like the journalism landscape has just, many news outlets and organizations have just forgotten that mantra and training and have just picked a side and make that very clear. But so they were influences in the sense that they were very good writers and thinkers and talkers, and encouraged me to write and corrected me if I ended a sentence with a preposition. But I didn't really know that they were. I didn't really know that they had been journalists until later. I think just because kids are self-absorbed and don't interview their parents about their careers. But I got into it. I just joined the junior high school newspaper on a lark, I guess, and I remember actually that the advisor of the paper, he had a very laissez-faire approach to what his students wrote. I think largely because it just didn't matter that much because it's a little junior high school paper. So he just kind of let us all write whatever we wanted to write, and there wasn't a lot of clamp down on bias or opinion or snarkiness or anything like that. He was just anything to sort of encourage kids to just like doing this. I think he saw as good, as a positive thing. And so I just remember having really free reign to be very like opinionated and critical of anything I thought was happening at the school that I like didn't agree with. And I found it really empowering and fun. Like, who listens to the opinions of a 13-year-old? But I kind of felt like here I had this opportunity to write things and people would read them, and I would hear about what they like. I would hear that they read them and hear their reaction, and I was just like very invigorating to me. I even got threatened with a lawsuit for an article I wrote in that newspaper by a couple of administrators. So,
wow,
like,
that's awfully young.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, I was young. Yeah, I had written this story about, I don't know how I came across it, but it was a story about this special education teacher in the district who had been sort of pushed out of her job via like bureaucratic harassment. Basically, it's very hard to fire a teacher, and the two administrators who oversaw her were unhappy with it for whatever reason. I never really understood that. And they got her out by, conducting repeated like performance evaluations and just sort of making her job and life very hard. And she, for whatever reasons, like she agreed to talk to me about it. And I wrote a story, and then the administrators wrote a threatening letter to my vice principal saying, in regard to, Winston Ross's article of such and such day, we're seeking legal counsel.
Interesting. Oh my goodness. I guess they were like just. What year was this? So I like to kind of gauge approximately when this was occurring, just so to kind of give me a timeline.
Would have been 1990.
Oh, okay. You're pretty young then. Okay. So, because some people are shaped by the 60s or the 70s or Vietnam. So you're on the younger side. Okay.
Well, I grew up reading both NEWSWEEK, actually, and the San Francisco Chronicle. And I was a big sports fan as a kid. So I read that Sporting Green all the time, which is like what they called the sports section in the Chronicle. And Herb Caen was one of my favorite columnists. And then I don't know that I didn't really have like other like journalism heroes. I read a lot as a kid, and I just I just liked reading and I liked writing.
What
I'd
books?
say probably.
What books did you like to read?
Steinbeck has always been my favorite author.
Of course.
Like far and away. He's just like his ability to draw parallel between two things that are seemingly obscure and extract some meaning out of that similarity. It's just like and in such like kind of a down to earth way. Like he was never a very like flowery or prosaic writer. Like he was just he just has this kind of understated, simple genius that I just he was definitely like who I wanted to be as a writer for sure.
Okay, well that's interesting. So then we'll fast forward a little bit to maybe your first job or school. I mean, I'm sure when you got to college you continued down that road of writing. And
yeah, I went to I was on my high school newspaper as well. And everyone else on the paper went on to like take sort of respectable income generating careers, and I was hooked on journalism from the time I was in junior high. So I went to journalism school at Missouri, and did a couple of internships. Like my first job at like a real newspaper was at this tiny little paper in Anniston, Alabama, which is just like this really incredible, colorful, old Southern place to work with these big characters as editors and fellow reporters. And I mean, it was just a superb introduction to like real world journalism. And because the staff was so small and the paper was so small, there wasn't a lot of like ego and bureaucracy around what reporters got to do. Like, so I had like 7 or 8 front page stories in my first couple weeks there. And at some point in the summer, I went into the managing editor's office. His name was Chris Waddell, and I hadn't seen my girlfriend in a month by then, and I was jonesing for love, and I wanted to go back to see her and go to see a Dave Matthews concert that she was excited about going to. But there was no way I could afford it on like a $240 a week salary. So I asked him to I know what it was. I was worried that my car wouldn't make it all the way up there. So I was looking into renting a car, but I wasn't old enough to rent a car. So I asked my managing editor if he would rent a car for me and let me drive it up to Missouri. And yeah, he had the same reaction you did. Like, he just leaned back in his chair and laughed. And he said, Sean, I'm not going to rent a car for you, but I will put you on a Greyhound bus and you can write about riding the bus. And I was like, okay, that sounds great. So I took a Greyhound from Alabama back up to Missouri, and it was like a 20-hour ride, and I wrote this huge story about it. It was like one of the longest stories I've ever written, and got to go to the concert.
Great. Well, that worked out for you.
Yeah, it did.
So what did you do after you got your first experience, your real experience with a small paper in a southern town? What came next, or were you freelancing for anybody else, or?
No, in journalism school, you're pushed pretty hard to just kind of do internship after internship, because the bigger paper you get to before you graduate, the better your chances of getting a real job when you get out are. And
right.
I went from there to the Kansas City Star, which is a great, big metro newspaper.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that had a great investigative journalism reputation, and it won a bunch of Pulitzer. So I was really happy to get that internship, and they had their own writing coach there, and it was also just a fantastic experience. Definitely more kind of bureaucratic and hierarchical. Like, it was much harder to get on the front page of the Star, but it was a big deal. Like, I think my first front page story was about this neighborhood where the city planners had decided that a bunch of old, beautiful trees that had been there for hundreds of years needed to be torn down because the roots were disrupting the sidewalks. And I wrote a story about the neighbors had taken it to calling it a hit list. And so I wrote a story about this hit list of trees, and it made the front page, and I was, of course, very excited about that. Yeah, so that was my next sort of job. It was an internship as well, but then I was working weekends at the Star after during my last semester at college.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. Trees do deserve the front page of a magazine. You being in Oregon, I'm sure you appreciate a tree.
I did, and the thing is, like, when you're in a place like Kansas City in the summer, these big, maples and sweet gums and cherry trees would like shade the entire street that these people lived on. And so the temperature difference between having a street like that with no trees on it and having a street where there's just this entire shade corridor is dramatic. Like, it would change everything to cut those trees down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how long did you stay there?
So I was just in Kansas City for a summer and then my last semester, and then I moved down to Baja, California, actually right after college, and
Well, that's
I had
place.
yeah, it was fun. I had a buddy who was a Navy SEAL who broke his back rappelling out of a helicopter, and he was on like a lifetime disability, and he just took it and lived in Baja and surfed every day. And so he invited me and a few of my friends to come down there and spend some time after we graduated. And so we just lived on the beach and like set up a little little camp in an arroyo, and I started applying for jobs from there, like my first newspaper jobs, and I was like typing my cover letters on an old Royal typewriter in what we call the biblioteca, which was just like a little tent that we put books in this typewriter in, and I would go in there and like write my cover letters, and then every 4 or 5 days we'd go into town, and I don't know how, so I would mail the cover letters, but check my, email for news of potential job opportunities every 4 or 5 days. And eventually I got 2 offers, one out in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, working for the Spokesman Review out of Spokane, and another at the Greensboro News and Record in North Carolina. And I picked Coeur d'Alene just because it's just so beautiful up there in northern Idaho, and I wanted to explore that area, and they moved me. I was broke by the time I got the job offer. Like, I had been living on a little bit of a graduation present, and then I didn't even have like a plane ticket to get home, and the paper graciously flew me out of there back to Missouri to like pick up my stuff, and then out to Spokane to set up shop. So that was how it all started.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that's when it started, huh? What was the first story you covered there?
I don't know what the first story was, but the
big
first
story.
big story I covered was there was this, like, I don't know how many of you or your listeners will remember Ruby Ridge, but it was this standoff between the federal government and some basically separatists up in North Idaho that led to this kind of this fiasco where the FBI stormed in, and we had a kind of a similar situation that started to brew in North Idaho when I was up there, where a woman's this family, the patriarch of the family, died, and I think somehow as a result of the death investigation, the sheriff's deputies, prosecutors or some kind of investigators decided that the woman needed to be arrested for sort of neglecting the family and neglecting the kids. And so they arrested her. And then when they came back, there were 5 children in the family. When they came back to pick up the kids and take them to like social services, foreseeably for, a foster care placement, the oldest kid ran into the house yelling, "Get the guns." And then he unleashed of 27 snarling dogs at the sheriff's deputies who'd come there to pick them up. And then the kids barricaded themselves in the house for the next 5 days. And that obviously became a big story for the Spokesman Review. And after a few days of covering it, my editor at the time told me that, I had hit my 40 hours for the week, and he wanted me to take a day off. And I was incensed because I was a young reporter and I was super excited about this story. So I called the bureau chiefs of NEWSWEEK, Time, and U.S. News and World Report and offered I just told them what was going on. They mostly already knew what was going on, but I just told them that I was there and offered to, my services, basically, do you guys need anybody to cover this for you, et cetera, et cetera. And surprisingly, even to a reporter who had a year of experience at that point, they were really receptive, and they were like, all of them were like, yeah, we're following the situation. And Time and U.S. News and World Report both said, we're waiting until it gets bigger, basically, until the shots start getting fired or something. But U.S. News and World Report said, let us put you on our stringer list because we don't have anybody in that area right now, which is great. And NEWSWEEK said, yeah, we'd love to work on it with you. And they actually flew a reporter out from New York to cover the story with me, which was incredible. And it was I was a year into the job, and my dream was coming true already.
Great. I think that Donald had a question about Ruby Ridge. So Donald, do you want to jump in and ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, Winston. I covered Ruby Ridge along with a lot of other stuff in my book, Hidden History. Just from to the other side of this here, as far as, and I understand what you're reporting on is kind of the establishment line, but the way I looked at it, this is I don't know if you know Randy Weaver, the separatist, who is and later, of course, that a court awarded Randy Weaver and I believe his surviving daughters, I think it was $1 million or something like that. A jury did years later against the government. But as you know, the mother was killed by a sharpshooter, Lon Horiuchi, an FBI sharpshooter who was never punished. He shot her while she was holding her baby. And when you mentioned about the child running, that is true. But the other side here says that the people who had surrounded their little shack, and it was basically, they were separatists, there's no doubt about that, had killed his dog first. And so I'm just trying to give the other side here, understand this is why I think a lot of people, why conspiracy theories are formed and things like this, because on the surface, this looks like a really overkill on the part of, there were so many police and FBI that went on this very small little place. And as I understand, Randy Weaver's, the reason they were there is because Randy Weaver had refused to become an undercover agent and sell weapons and try to infiltrate some of these white nationalist groups. And he ended up being set up basically on a charge of selling a sawed-off shotgun that was like a quarter of an inch too short or something like that. And actually, I believe the rationale for when they actually came and arrived at his home was that he had not showed up for his court date, but his defense was that he had been given the wrong court date. So are you familiar with that other side of the story, or have you not heard it before, or I'm just wondering about that?
When you say other side of the story, are you suggesting that I presented one side of the story? Because my recollection of what I read about Ruby Ridge, and again, I wasn't there, was that, yeah, I mean, the feds were staking out the property. A dog started barking at one of the officers. The feds shot the dog, and then there was a standoff. And I don't have any defense of how the federal government handled that standoff. It was a huge, huge mishap. So if you're presenting the other side to something that you think I said, you may not have heard me correctly.
No, I'm not saying what you said was incorrect. I'm just saying I think it's how you look at it, and basically I understand what you were saying. It wasn't untrue, but I'm just saying as far as what precipitated it, and I think why people formed, same thing can be said, about Waco. probably even more so, where it's how these things are looked at, I think, where it's government overreach and however you look at it, there was, I don't know how many, did you cover it personally? Did you go there? Did you see how many, as I understand, there were
I was in school when Ruby Ridge happened, and so no, I didn't cover it personally. As I said, the only reason I mentioned Ruby Ridge was not to get into a debate about government tactics, but no, you're fine. I'm just trying to say that.
I thought that was you said that was your assignment or something. I guess you were covering it years later, you mean, or something, a story.
No. What I said was just that Ruby Ridge had happened, and as a result, when this other thing happened, it reminded people of Ruby Ridge, and people were sort of wondering whether it was going to be the next Ruby Ridge, et cetera, et cetera. So, no, I didn't cover it.
Okay, well, I misunderstood that then.
Okay, so then, all right, and then you were. How long did you work there for?
I was at the Spokesman Review for 3 years, and then I moved out to Oregon to take a job writing about the Oregon coast for the Eugene newspaper, the Register Guard.
Oh, really? Gosh, I brought that up. Yeah, the Oregon coast is something else. It's definitely a place, if anyone's listening, I know we get people from around the world, and I'm telling you, the Oregon coast is something else. I really just think it's a beautiful place.
Yeah, it was incredible. I mean, it was a job where they sort of, like, I'd gone from working in an office to this opportunity to just kind of like run a bureau from my house. And I did some interviews at the paper in Eugene, and then they said, okay, well, you're done with that. Now we've got you booked at this awesome hotel out on the coast called the South Shan for the next couple nights. Just go out there and look around and see what you think of it. And of course, like, I'd been to the coast when I was a little kid, but, going out there and thinking about living out there and getting to write about like fishermen and shipwrecks and all the stuff that you could write about on the coast was, way too much to turn away.
Yeah, I agree. Like those little town Netarts where a lot of fishermen go, and there's Tillamook, and oh gosh, there's just so many wonderful little places. Rockaway is kind of a fun little place to go too. Those are close to Portland, easy to get to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's full of awesome little towns.
Yeah, definitely. It's just a nice place. And Oregon, despite what people realize, they just think it's raining all the time. But we have probably the most gorgeous summer in the States. It's just perfect and temperate, not rainy at all. And we did get a little hot, though, that's for sure. We got hot this year, at least.
Yeah, you don't tend to get the forest fire inundation of smoke that we do in the valley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of fires going on. Those California fires are something else.
Yeah, they've been bad this year.
They sure have. So, then, and you contribute to Newsweek, and you write articles. You do investigative reporting. What kind of investigative reporting have you done? Anything? Because I know the people that listen to me they're very interested in technology, whistleblowing, stories that don't get a lot of coverage, and investigative reporting. They like to hear that. They like to hear about stories like that require that.
Yeah, most of the kind of long-form investigative work I did or have done in my career, which is like about 20 years now, was at the Register Guard, because in a newspaper setting, at least in the good old days where we had enough staffers, you could take a few months or 6 months or a year and tackle a project. And probably the biggest investigative story I did when I was at the newspaper was on a guy named Frank Dulcich, and he's the owner of a company called Pacific Seafoods, which is I believe still the largest
seafood
distributor.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Sure is. Been that way for 30, 40 years. Or 30 years, I think.
Yeah. And so Pacific Seafoods is, a lot of fishermen love Frank and love his company because he, by getting bigger and bigger and more powerful, he's been able to sort of expand into new markets and leverage leverage his company's size to get fish from the West Coast into supermarkets where they might otherwise stock farmed salmon or some other kind of lesser quality product. But a lot of other fishermen say that that Frank and his company have used really monopolistic tactics to drive out competitors and sort of put smaller companies up and down the West Coast out of business as he grows in size. And so I did a year-long investigative profile of Mr. Dulcich that sort of just examined the two theories about him, or the two kind of prevailing feelings about him. One of which was that he was this, really helpful, smart, shrewd businessman who had figured out a way to compete in this kind of increasingly global and globalized fish industry, and another that felt like he was just a rapacious monopolist who didn't, who's made the industry worse.
I see. And then, so you also write about technology, and that's something that is very fascinating. We, of course, can get into politics. So what type of technology pieces have you written? What do you cover?
Most of the technology stuff I've written has been, was during my tenure at the Daily Beast, which is an online news site that's gotten really big and popular.
I just interviewed Thor Benson. He may be newer. You may not know who he is, but yeah, I just interviewed him on Tuesday. Great paper. Actually, I'm really intrigued by it. I like that paper a lot.
Yeah. It's Tina Brown, the woman who founded it. She used to say that what the Daily Beast wanted to be was visceral, and I always liked that word to describe the paper, because it did, like, they want their stories to sort of reach out and grab you and make you think, and sometimes that's a little bit sensational, but most of the time it's just that they wanted to have a very they wanted to go after stories that were really just really compelling. And so some of the technology stories I wrote for them would include just like covering like Apple Watch releases, or like the new Grand Theft Auto or Auto 5 video game, and just kind of like consumer tech stuff. I did cover CES, the big consumer electronics show, for them, and tried to figure out a unique way to write about that convention, which is like swarmed by tech companies and journalists alike. And so it's really hard to like find an angle. And I wound up finding a couple of people I thought were really interesting who were kind of in the tech world, but a little lesser known, and just writing profiles about them. So yeah, tech is an interesting subject.
What do you think about AI? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the same thing. It sounds like you're talking about AI. As somebody who's
great minds. Because our minds think alike.
I write exactly. I write about economics too, and I'm concerned over the lack of jobs that we have already, as in terms of as opposed to job applicants. If we lose millions of jobs to AI, I'm just trying to figure out how that's going to work, because that would mean millions more looking for jobs and hopefully make our lives easier. But you still need money to survive. You have any thoughts on that?
I mean, the whole kind of jobs versus technology question is a pretty big, complicated economic question. I'm not necessarily more concerned about losing jobs to AI as I am like any other technology. Like the fact is that as technology advances, we lose jobs because that's the whole point of a lot of technology is just to reduce the amount of workers that it takes to complete a widget. So I mean, AI is just another example of a technology that threatens jobs. But in the place of jobs that might be lost in like manufacturing or, factories, you also have a lot of new jobs coming online that are related to advancements in technology. Coding jobs and jobs doing creative work and like making and designing some of the stuff. So I think the thing is that I'm not an economist, so I can't tell you like how the numbers compare in terms of like how many jobs technology or AI replaces versus adds to the economy. But I think the biggest the issue for people, if you're just talking about this as a as a societal issue, really what happens is that as jobs and industries and certain types of technology become obsolete, the transition into another means of making a living is entirely dependent on education and retraining opportunities available to them. And if we're concerned about jobs being lost by AI, we should be doubling down on our investment in education and retraining opportunities.
Yeah, that seems to be an issue.
As someone who's older, a little older here, I remember all those old World's Fairs in the back, and the Disney World thing, the future ride they have, and the flying Jetson bubble cars and so forth. I'm waiting for this fantastic technology. Do you see anything down the road where we're going to have new forms of energy, or we're going to have teleportation? I mean, things that I think people might have predicted we'd be closer to at this point. It just seems like we're still so dependent on all the old forms of transportation and other than obviously these little devices we have. Is wonderful. They're making smartphones able to do more and more. But as far as big things like that, as far as new forms of energy, new forms of being able to, like I said, something like teleportation or something. Do you think anything like that is on the horizon?
I'm with you. When I was younger, I always sort of imagined that like in the year 2018. Yeah, we'd be in flying cars and we'd have like, spaceships and like we'd be doing like really amazingly cool stuff. And I think some of the technological advancements of the last decade or two have been pretty remarkable in terms of in terms of like the power of the internet and the power of data. But I think there's like, it's frustrating because there's so much of what technology has done in the last couple of decades that's turned out to be pretty insidious and harmful versus being helpful in advancing humankind. And like, yeah, I mean, whenever people ask me like what my superpower would be, I always say teleportation, because like there's just can you imagine like there would be no traffic on the road. There'd be like no jumbo jets like burning through billions of gallons of fossil fuel to like get people from one place to the next. I mean, I'm sure there'd be 100,000 problems with it. Like people teleporting into the same place at the same time and their bodies morphing into one or whatever. But I'm certainly I don't know what's on the horizon, but I'm with you. Like I'm disappointed that there aren't like bigger, cooler things that we get to do and see and play with.
Would you agree with me though, as far as people like me? I'm out here on the extreme, so I'm always thinking radical things. But as far as the impact, let's say I've always said the reason why we're still dependent upon these fossil fuels is because the oil companies make so unbelievable profits out of it. Let's say someone came up, and there have been people that have come up with energy devices and so forth. What kind of I mean, do you agree that kind of an impact on that? Same thing with medicine. If somebody came up with a cure for cancer, what would that do to the medical industry? Some of these things, do you see a possibility like someone like me does where I'm cynical about that, where I'm thinking that these people that are making such a huge profit from the old technologies, if something like that, teleportation, what would happen to the airlines? I mean, something. Do you understand?
No, I share your cynicism 100%. I mean, there's in field after field, like there's a track record of companies that have entrenched, business interests slowing down or thwarting the advancement of an alternative technology in order to, because they're making plenty of money off of the old way. Like oil and pharmaceuticals are two great examples, fossil fuels and pharmaceuticals. I mean, the people who pay for the research into advancements into technology have to already have money to pay for it. And so if you're trying to develop some kind of brand new technology, where does the money come from, and who profits? And if it threatens some existing, profit center or industry, you can bet that industry is going to find ways to slow it down or shut it down or, make it controversial or just, just like fight it in one way or another. So I don't know. I mean, it'd be interesting to think about like what the world would be like if there weren't that kind of like corrupt kind of ecosystem around development and investment. If we just all developed things because there was a greater common good, I would, maybe we'd all be in flying cars. If that were the case.
Well, Nikola Tesla, his work is more popular than ever. I mean, they have the Tesla files on television, and people understand and he was talking about free energy for everyone and free power. You're talking about 80 years ago, and no one seems to know where his work is or what happened to it. But I mean, I can almost understand how people who are profiting the way that the oil companies are, or the medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the insurance industry, I can almost understand why they would. I think it was wrong, but I can understand they have such a vested financial interest in blocking this kind of progress. Because if you had even the utility companies, if one of these, let's say Nikola Tesla, someone could develop what he said. If we have free electrical power, what would that mean for the utility companies? Is something like that? I mean, your thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, again, like I just agree. Like, corporations are by definition designed to only really pay attention to the bottom line, and so anything that comes along that threatens that, they're sort of as a machine and as an entity, like they don't really have any choice but to try to fight it. I mean, I think that all these concepts of like free energy and free power, the only way to make stuff like that happen in the world that we live in today, which is governed by kind of underregulated crony capitalism, is for consumers to demand something different and to just stop buying products that make fossil fuel companies rich, and just insist on a different way, because it's the only way that any of these companies will change if they're forced to by the declining profits.
Well, I'm driving my Prius. That's about the most I can do because I can't afford a Tesla or some of these full electric cars. But that's what I'd really love to see. But again, the cynic in me says that if they made electric cars, or even electric cars, and I'd like to see them go beyond that. I think there are other forms of energy, but let's say just for the sake of, electric car technology has been a Henry Ford. Since the days of Henry Ford, they knew about the electric car. But if they did that, would you agree? I just think that they would find some way to try to make. They certainly couldn't make the kind of profits they make with gas, but I think they would come up with astronomically priced charging stations or something, or they already have it. So you can't drive only 200 miles or whatever. I don't know what the capacity is for them now, but so I think it would take a lot for people to get used to that. But I just think that they would do something like that. I can't.
They would have to. I mean, they shouldn't, but we know that they would, because ultimately it's capitalism.
If you want to live in a world where that doesn't happen, you have to fight consolidation of these companies such that they become so powerful that they can do exactly what you're saying. If there's enough free market competition out there, if every single merger of all these kind of major companies isn't just like rubber stamped by the government, and companies are forced to remain, at a reasonable size, then they never take on enough power to just be like, okay, all of the electrical charging stations are going to charge exorbitant rates, or all the cars are going to cost way too much money. Like the only way to maintain a system where these prices and these decisions that companies make are fair is competition.
Well, in your industry though, wouldn't you say? I mean, you work for Newsweek. Isn't it down to is it 6 media conglomerates with all this merger mania everywhere that own virtually all the mainstream media? Or do you work for one of these big giants? And you must. I mean, if you're in the mainstream media.
Yeah, this is something I'd like to talk about a little bit. You being a journalist and being on the inside, and I love journalists. I really want to hear what your thought is behind that, and the overreach and the bureaucracy, and I'm just curious because I hear both sides of the story, but we just wonder how much control there really is over journalists and the printing of stories, and so I'd love to have kind of have an in-depth discussion about this if you'd like.
Sure. I mean, there is an unsettling degree of consolidation in the mass media in general. Like in the same, basically, it's just as there is in pretty much every other industry in the world. I think that, I mean, just for the record, Newsweek is owned by a company called International Business Times, and IBT owns just Newsweek, and the International Business Times, or the parent company just owns Newsweek, and then this website, this International Business Times. And so Newsweek isn't part of any conglomerate in particular. Most print media is, I don't know if I should say most, but there's a lot of most of the sort of bigger print institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, these are all independent. These are all owned by different companies. So in the print media business, at least some of the bigger institutions, they tend to be owned by different companies. So you don't have the same conglomeration that you see in, say, cable, television, or stuff like that. Like there's just not as much monopolization happening. When it comes to smaller local television stations and smaller local newspapers, on the other hand, those are increasingly being kind of gobbled up by corporations like Sinclair in TV, and and in print, Franck and Gannett. And so the effect of that as a working journalist, the effect of that conglomeration, it's really what I would say that I see more than anything is that when a newspaper is bought up by a corporation, again, like corporations are driven by profit, and newspapers have had historically high, like ridiculously high profit margins, somewhere, between 15 and 25% versus like a grocery store or a restaurant that like is ecstatic if they make a 1% profit margin year over year. And so, newspapers were once a cash cow where you could charge these exorbitant rates for tiny little classified ads. You'd pay like $35 a day for like a paragraph in an advertisement, and then a newspaper could sell page after page after page of that, and that resulted in these incredible profit margins for newspapers. But then as Craigslist and the internet came along to just eat into that ad revenue, the profit margins just couldn't be sustained anymore. But if you're a newspaper and you're owned by a corporation that is answering to shareholders that demand growth, quarter after quarter sales growth, and all of the metrics in your industry are declining, the only way to meet that growth is to cut your staff, to cut your pages, and to just do less invest less in your product. And so what you see with consolidation, at least in the print industry, which I can speak to a lot more than I can in broadcast, is just a poorer quality product.
Well, I've quite working in the. Are you still working for Newsweek, as I understand it?
I'm a freelancer.
Okay,
I write for Newsweek more than any other single publication.
Well, again, going way back, I mean, Newsweek and Time used to be the big deal. I mean, that was those were huge national, and same thing with newspapers. I mean, I live in Washington D.C. and I did as a child. Also, we had Washington Post, Washington Star was a great newspaper, Washington Daily News. And I understand that people, the only people you see, if you can tell how old somebody is, you can see people like over 60 or over 70. They're the ones that are still buying the actual hard copies of newspapers and I guess subscribing to magazines like Newsweek. How does that, I often wonder how someone like Newsweek went from the kind of readership they used to have to
the
what
paper
they must
circulation,
have. Yeah, and I mean, how? Because I know local news stations around here and everywhere, they've had to cut back staff. Even things like ESPN, they've had to cut back dramatically. Have you seen a lot of that? And as a freelancer, maybe you don't, but maybe when you were at Newsweek, did you?
Sure. I mean, the kind of big picture things that have happened to magazines are the same as what have happened to newspapers. You have a steep drop-off in advertising revenue as online forms of advertising come on. Like Google sells you an ad for like a 100th the price of a print ad in a news magazine. So like, why do I buy? If I'm a business owner, why do I buy a print ad in a news magazine whose results I can't really track? Like I can't see if I put this ad, how many people click on it, how many people click through to my website, how many people click through to a product on my website and buy that product. Like Google and other online advertisers can offer those kind of metrics and measuring abilities that print journalism just can't do, and they can do it for a fraction of the price. So like ultimately it just like there's just that hurts the bottom line of these companies so much that they have to cut back staff and get smaller and just put out a weaker product than they once did. There are many exceptions to the rule. Like the New York Times and the Washington Post are two of them who whose circulations are growing, especially because there's a lot of concern about keeping track of what's happening in the federal government today. The New York Times, as I understand it, their print circulations doubled since Donald Trump was elected president. And, so there are some people out there that are making good money in journalism, but it's just a tough industry, largely because of ad revenue.
Winston, hold on just a second. We have a station break, and are we going to break yet? Maybe not quite yet. Just so you know, we're in a few seconds here, we'll be heading to a station break, and we'll pick it up after that.
Okay.
Well, welcome back, everybody. In case you're just joining us, I'm with Mr. Winston Ross, contributing writer at Newsweek, and I'm here with my friend Donald Jeffries, the author of Hidden History. So we were just having a discussion. We're talking about how the news outlets are working, and I'll just turn it back over to you guys. We're in the middle of a discussion here, so go ahead.
Hi, John. You might have to take it. I can't remember what we were talking about.
Where were we at, Donald? Do you remember exactly where we were? I was kind of focusing on the clock. We were just talking about some of the different companies, the various companies. I don't know where Donald went. He may not be here. So anyways, wherever you think that we were off, next time I'll pay a little closer attention. I was just watching the clock so carefully.
Well, I think we were talking a little bit about like consolidation in the news business, I guess.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the different various companies and which some of the names you mentioned I hadn't even heard before. So it's very interesting to me to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I think consolidation in the news business is interesting for sort of different reasons than consolidation in other industries like tech industry or other consumer products or something like in broadcast, for example, with the like Sinclair Broadcasting Group, you have some examples of scripts being sent out to news anchors and then being required to read them. Like this came out a few months ago that Sinclair executives sent out these scripts about sort of fake news and this it was this kind of propagandist rhetoric that a lot of which is coming from the Trump administration, where they're basically saying like, yeah, we agree that so many people in the media are just putting out false information and distorting the facts and And what we are going to do is be sure to, not do that or hold our counterparts in the media accountable. And it was pretty I think it was Deadspin that first noticed that these words were so similar in one broadcast after the other, and they went out and basically found 20 Sinclair-owned stations that were each having their anchors read the same script over and over again, and then they put they did a story about it and did a video where they put one clip after another of basically anchors reading exactly the same thing, and it was a real chilling demonstration of what can happen when one politically bent company owns a bunch of local TV stations that are not supposed to be political. It's one thing if MSNBC leans to the right and Fox News leans to the left, or sorry, the other way around. But when you turn on your local TV news, you expect to just see stories about county fairs and crime. It's not supposed to be like an extension of the political will of the owner of that corporation. And so, conglomeration plays out in different ways.
It seems to. Do you think there was a point in time when you thought that maybe true journalism, real journalism, kind of died or took a turn for the worse? Is there a specific moment that you thought that, wow, something's going on with journalism as a whole?
Real journalism has not died. The business model is just has just changed dramatically. So, you know, there are in the internet age, there have been entire new news organizations like ProPublica and the Center for Public Integrity and a bunch of great websites like Intercept and Daily Beast and I mean I could go on and on that have all sprung up in this new era as legacy media outlets have suffered. So it's not that like journalism is dead or anything like that. It's just a very complicated picture. You know, like in a big picture sense, you know, the fragmentation of media in this country and in the world has really contributed a lot to the hyper partisanship that has our country currently in gridlock, because we no longer have, you know, most people watching the same few news stations that are held to very strict standards of, objectivity and fairness. Now we can basically just hide out in whatever political and information bubble that reinforces our beliefs, and none of them are really held to any particular, held to the same standard that they once were. Like, there still is a standard, and there still is a lot of like shaming and jumping up and down if, somebody publishes something that's blatantly wrong or false. But for the most part, people on the left and people on the right, they live in their own bubbles and they don't listen to each other. They don't talk to each other. They don't even have the same Facebook friends at this point. And that, that's due to like an incredible fragmentization of media offerings.
Yeah, that's kind of detrimental, though, because I think we need both sides. I think there needs to be that conversation to find the truth, and just have an open up. It's very discouraging to me.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think I sort of wish that there was like, I wish that there could at least be like one or two places that everyone agreed you could get, fair information from. And, from my perspective, that's like the New York Times and NPR. But on the right, like those two entities would be considered liberal and left-leaning and not to be trusted. So,
right.
I don't know where you go with it.
Yeah, there's we all, I think, distrust something. We all get our news from somewhere, and that's, we're all kind of a combination of what our sources are. But obviously, Trump is the wild card factor here. I've never seen anything like that, the Donald Trump phenomenon. But you, as a journalist inside that medium, obviously Trump has impacted the media and the country more than I've never seen. He is the lightning rod of all lightning rods. We literally, like, if we started talking about any political issue at all, anything, there's no way we can talk about it without Trump touching it, or a cultural issue, really. He is in the middle of everything. But I'm wondering, like, don't people in the media, because obviously he's in an ongoing battle with the mainstream media and fake news and all that. But I would think, some of them at least look at him as being good for business? You mentioned a shocking fact. I can't believe the New York Times, any subscription, any newspaper has gone up. But you said since Trump is in office. So, I mean, wouldn't they look at this guy as, regardless of how we feel about him, maybe he's great for business? I mean, I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I mean, I've had this conversation with colleagues before, that like Trump for as sort of bad as he is for a lot of industries and for civil discourse and Like, I mean, don't even get me started. He's certainly, I mean, he's certainly like, people at the New York Times certainly can thank him for that boost in subscriptions. Like, there's no question about it. Like, whether, you know, the thing is that his style of governance is basically to be a master of sort of distraction and entertainment and ratings and shock value. And so what he does is he'll, when the news cycle is not working in his favor for some reason, like when there's some scandal based on some, you know, something that's going on in the administration or something about Paul Manafort or whatever, he'll say something outrageous on Twitter or announce a outrageous new policy or, you know, like, and engage in, you know, diplomatic talks with North Korea, and you have to question the motive, because it always comes during a time when something bad is happening in the news cycle for him. And so what that does is it keeps that style of governance keeps people in the news business just hopping, trying to cover what he does and to kind of let people know the implications of each move. Like he's in some ways he's like one of the busiest presidents we've ever had, and at least in terms of how much noise he makes and how many kind of controversial things he says and does that result in these big media firestorms. It's just like it takes up a lot of energy in the room, you know.
Mm-hmm. Would you say there's a possibility? A lot of people think that we could have another civil war here, the way the country's divided. Let's say, as maybe as unlikely as it sounds, I really think there's a good chance Trump could be reelected, especially if the Democrats revert to their recent history, and if they don't nominate somebody like maybe Bernie Sanders or somebody, if they nominate kind of an insider type that Trump could easily make fun of and his supporters, I see a real chance of him being reelected. How do you think the half of the country that hates him would respond to that? I mean, do you think there's a possibility? We've already seen demonstrations and so forth, and just that this just can't be accepted. I mean, I worry about this happening. Do you think there's a possibility of something like that?
I mean, you raise a lot of issues. Like the first one, a civil war, I think, is very unlikely. Like the number of people who are making noise about a civil war and making threats of violence and talking about, like, you know, basically talking about Alex Jones and his series of ridiculous conspiracy theories, like, they're a pretty small number. The vast majority of Americans in this country are above it. Like they may be partisan in politics, and they may think that the other side is stupid or, you know, just flat out wrong. But like the notion that ordinary Americans who, you know, drive to Starbucks every day and you know, like watch big screen TV, Netflix, are gonna decide to pick up arms and start shooting each other because they don't like each other's political differences is just like pretty unfathomable. I mean, there are going to be some wingnuts, largely on the right, who could be whipped up into, you know, violence, sure, by people like Alex Jones and others who've got their heads filled with like all this crazy conspiracy theories. But I don't think, a civil war takes like huge majorities of people on both sides to start fighting with each other, and it's just like that's just not who we are. Like we don't hate each other that much.
I think it's a civil war. Yeah, I think a civil war in words is what it seems to be, what it might pan out to be. I feel. And it's just really strange because now, like, the conservatives and the right wing, they're the conspiracy theorists. What happened? It seems like the people on the right are now, you have people like Alex Jones, as you've mentioned a couple times, and it's just interesting. But with that said, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are not conspiracies to me, and just from my own personal research, and Donald too. It's just one of those things where until you go down those rabbit holes and start looking for the facts, sometimes they just seem kind of fluffy. I don't know what the right word to use, but so it's just interesting. It's interesting the dynamics of politics right now, and the two parties. I think a lot of people I know are just somewhere in the middle. They really just can't. They don't feel like they can commit to either side because everything's so transverse now.
Well, the reason I probably shouldn't use the term civil war, but I'm very active on social media, promoting my writing and everything. And since Trump became a candidate, I'm caught in the crossfire because I think the country breaks down basically onto a love him or hate him. There's not much middle ground with Trump, but I'm kind of in that. I try to be in that middle ground because I when he does something, the few times that because once in a while he makes sense, and when he says something, but I've lost friends on both sides. I mean, you either, oh God, how can you? It doesn't matter what, and so. Right. I get it's very frustrating. That's what I say. And these are reasonable. A lot of the people that I've known for years in a cyber sense that are good people, but they just have broken down completely over this Trump, who has the most divisive personality I've ever seen. So that's why I just think I don't think anybody else could even possibly cause this kind of division. But you just go back to before the election of Trump. I mean, we saw a little bit of divisiveness because a lot of people were obviously older people were reacted negatively to Obama being elected, but it was nothing like what we see in Trump. And I just think it's really casting light on how divided the country is. So civil war may be too dramatic of a term, but I don't know what you would see. I just think that if Trump was reelected, especially, I think I don't know what you'll see, but I think at least you'll see probably even bigger demonstrations than you have so far.
Mm-hmm. Sure, we're certainly like a polarized and paralyzed country politically. Like there's no question about it. And Trump is not the only polarizing figure in American politics today. Hillary was equally as disliked by probably just about as many people as Trump was. I mean, maybe less, but like she's a very polarizing figure as well. I don't, in terms of what you said earlier, Donald, like I think that, the Democrats, it's not easy to say if the Democrats pick some, establishment insider candidate, they're going to lose. It's a pretty careful gamble on the part of Democrats because, if they don't, like, pundits said that Donald Trump was a terrible choice to choose to run for president, and everybody in the Republican establishment tried to stop it, and everybody in the news media said there's no way he's going to win, and he's too polarizing, and he's too this and he's too that, but he was authentic enough for enough people, and he had. He energized his base in the way that no other candidate on his side did, and it was enough to carry him to victory because people on the left felt lackluster about Hillary, or they felt angry that she had, in their minds, like stolen the primaries from Bernie, and so it's not easy to say like, oh, the Democrats just need to elect this kind of person or that kind of person. Like presidential elections are very person specific. Like whoever it is that comes, that it gets winnowed to these final few candidates that come out of a primary battle. You have to look at each individual and look at their electability and look at like what's happening in that moment in the country. Like, how's the economy doing? How do people feel about the current administration? Who controls Congress? It's impossible to say 2 years out like what the right choice is for either party. Like, but in answer to what you said earlier, like Trump could absolutely be reelected again. There's no, I mean, any incumbent president has the home field advantage, if nothing else, you know.
Well, if I can throw a hypothetical at you, it kind of, and when you touched a little bit on Hillary, and a lot of us think that the nomination was stolen from Bernie Sanders. Senator Rand Paul just a few days ago came up with a proposal. I think it's a pretty good one, is to bring Julian Assange back and give him what do you call it? And if he can't, not let him be prosecuted for anything, to testify about WikiLeaks, and especially about the murder of Seth Rich, which a lot of us are interested in, and those DNC emails. What do you think would happen as far as, would the Democratic Party have enough courage if, let's say, Julian Assange went in and said, yeah, Seth Rich was definitely my leak. He's the guy that leaked the emails, not the Russians. He was murdered, still unsolved murder. Would they have enough? And we did, the Democratic Party, as we showed in the year, was from the beginning set out to deny Bernie Sanders a nomination. Would they have enough guts? I mean, Bernie Sanders will be pretty old in 2020, but would they do something like I said? Really, I think that's the only way they could beat Trump at this point. If they put, because I think Sanders could beat him, but how do you think that would affect people? Because that would be just a huge story if Julian Assange, but I don't know, maybe you don't agree with me on that, but I think it would be, and I thought it was a good proposal by Senator Paul.
I honestly, that hypothetical is like pretty wide-ranging and like based on a number of conclusions about like the validity of the Seth Rich story and like opinions about Julian Assange that I just couldn't. I don't know where to start with it, really. Like if Assange wants to say that and blow open that conspiracy and lend some truth to what questions people have, like go ahead, do it now. But as far as like how it would impact the election and Bernie Sanders and all that other stuff, I think it's a little too hypothetical of a hypothetical, honestly.
Mm-hmm. What's your opinion on Edward Snowden? Since we're talking about whistleblowers, so we kind of segue into that.
Yeah, I mean, Snowden is. Let me just preface it by saying that I'm not really I wouldn't really consider myself an expert on the Snowden case or the Assange case, so I may say something ignorant. But in general, I feel like I just sort of, I guess what I would say is that I emotionally feel like Edward Snowden feels like a whistleblower to me. He feels like somebody who saw something happening in his government that he was concerned about, and he decided to call attention to it. Like that's how we define whistleblowers, and we have whistleblower protection laws, and we have whistleblower protection status for people who do that, knowing that sometimes they're breaking a law to get out the information that they feel like is important to get out. So, I don't see how you can argue that Ed Snowden is anything but a whistleblower. Like if he had a genuine concern about what was happening in this government and what he did, and if what he did was just to release information that proved that what he's concerned about is actually happening, that America is spying on its own citizens in violation of their constitutional rights, how is he not a whistleblower? I just don't see it. I don't know how you get there.
Well, we're certainly on the same page there, but how would you feel about Julian Assange and Bradley Chelsea Manning? I mean, to me, they're both whistleblowers as well. Would you agree with that?
I have to say, like, I know less about Julian Assange, so I wouldn't disagree with you. He's such a kind of a complicated figure, and WikiLeaks has had so much has happened with WikiLeaks since it began that I don't have as clear of a sort of a right and wrong opinion about him and WikiLeaks, like I in general, I can say that I definitely favor transparency and openness. I think what's challenging about WikiLeaks is that, there is a reason for, classified information to be classified. Like we can't conduct every amount of government business out in public because we have enemies in the world who would love to be inside of every single, classified briefing and every single boardroom. So like the WikiLeaks approach is more to just sort of throw open the doors on everything and just release everything. And it's never really felt to me. And again, I caution this by saying that I'm not an expert in WikiLeaks, but it just never felt as sort of sincere as Snowden and as specific as what Snowden wanted to bring to light, which was NSA surveillance on U.S. citizens. WikiLeaks just feels like almost like data gossip, like oh, here we found this thing, let's just immediately post it and let everybody see it without regard for what is the kind of underlying cause that you're trying to bring about, other than fame and notoriety to Julian Assange.
Mm-hmm.
Chelsea Manning, again, I just sort of know less about that case, so I probably shouldn't speak to it. I probably said a bunch of false things already in the last 5 minutes.
You did all right. You did all right. What about you, Donald? What's your opinion on those? On Assange?
Yeah,
I actually don't know
obviously
that much what your opinion is.
Well,
not
Assange,
in depth.
I think Assange really illustrates this what I call the left-right paradigm, because Julian Assange was a hero. And again, I'm far to the left, but I find myself arguing with the left a lot, and it's obviously and a lot of it's because of Trump. But Julian Assange was a hero to the left because he first exposed a lot of things during the W. Bush administration.
Mm-hmm.
But when he released the DNC emails and he started things that were damaging to Hillary Clinton, suddenly the left became less likely to consider him any kind of a hero. And now, as far as Chelsea Manning, I don't know how anybody can argue with that, but unfortunately, I think there was more of a right punished because basically all that happened there was he exposed things like soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq playing soccer with decapitated human heads and killing dogs for sport and showing those videos and stuff. So to me, I don't know how you can be much more of a whistleblower than that. But he is considered a traitor by a lot of people. And I think Donald Trump said one of them should be executed. I don't know if it was Snowden or whoever it was. So if I was Julian Assange, Rand Paul made that suggestion, but they could promise him all the immunity he wanted, but I wouldn't set foot in America, especially with a wild card like Trump, because he would be liable to just demand that he be executed or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a tricky situation because a lot of these like disclosures of information and releases that are described as like patriotic are often politically motivated in one way or another. Like, why did we see the release of DNC emails when there's when we know that there's an incredible amount of back and forth between the Russians and the Trump campaign? Like, why? Like, where? Like, are we to believe that WikiLeaks just never stumbled across any of that stuff? Like, I don't know. I just feel like when I trust a person's motive that it's apolitical and it's just about like being concerned about a government abuse or government injustice, then I feel better about the release of information that could be damaging to national security, which means damaging to the lives of CIA agents that might be named or doxed or outed in these documents. Like you have to be careful when you release information, and if you're doing it, and if the way you release information is clearly politically motivated, and it puts the country and it puts government officials and real human beings in harm's way, I don't like. Are you a whistleblower, or are you just like a partisan hack?
Right.
Well, again, I think Assange though is he's looked at that way, but really considering he achieved his fame and his renown, and he had to go on the run because of what he originally released that was detrimental to George W. Bush. So I think but I don't know Assange. I mean, he could be certainly. I think he maybe likes the notoriety. I don't know, but I just look at something like Seth Rich, and I know Seth Rich is a kind of dirty word to some people, but the guy was murdered, and there was no robbery or anything. And if Julian Assange has all but named him, he hinted at it many times that he was the leaker. So if we find out that the guy that leaked these incriminating emails was murdered, I think to me that just as somebody who, as an investigative reporter, if I was an investigative reporter, I would be on that, and if I was an editor of a newspaper, I'd be assigning people that right now. Go talk to the people that treated Seth Rich, whatever. Find out what happened there, because then Seth Rich becomes a huge story. I mean, wouldn't you agree with that?
I mean, this hypothetical that you want to bring up at Seth Rich, like, sure, like if that turns out to be true, it would be a big story. If Vladimir Putin turns out to have personally, sat down with President Trump and agreed on an orchestration to steal the election, that would be a big story. If Mars and Earth collided, that would be a big story. I mean, there are lots of like crazy hypothetical things that could happen that would be big stories. Like, I don't know how to say it. Like, hypotheticals are just hypotheticals.
Right. Okay. So we still have about 25 more minutes. So maybe we can move on to, I don't know, what do you want to talk about, Winston? This is your show today.
I mean, I think it could be interesting to talk about the implications of Trump's rhetoric about the media. We're talking about whistleblowers and journalism.
Okay, I think that sounds good. We'll go ahead and do that. So, Donna, what's your thought on that? We'll start with you.
I'm a First Amendment purist. So, Winston, I'll be honest with you.
You really are.
Well, I mean, Ella and I have discussed this before. I think I'm the only civil libertarian left in America that agrees with Patrick Henry and Voltaire, and that I'll defend to your dying right. Your dying day, your right to say something, even though I disagree with it. It seems like no one in America wants that now. They want to shut down people they disagree with. So I think Trump, the reason why, I think Trump really gives red meat to his supporters when he throws out that fake news thing. Because so many of us out here, and again, I just from writing what I've written over the years, I distrust so many of the big media conglomerates, especially the corporate news, because I know that they have interlocking interest, and they don't investigate like they should, especially a lot of these political stories. So when Trump throws that out, I think he's people out there that already distrust him, they like it, but from my standpoint, I don't like it when people then act as if you're against journalism or against the news, because I want you guys to be doing. I'm mad that I think you're covering up things sometimes for powerful people. I want you to have free reign, and I want you to investigate everything. So I think what happens is Trump takes advantage of that, and they both kind of throw fake news back at each other, and it becomes an idiocracy. But I don't know, and that's why I brought up the Seth Rich thing. It's just one example, but I think I think that it's important for journalists to be real muckrakers and go after powerful figures, and not just Trump, because at this point, Trump, everybody's going after him. And I think it's, you can't prosecute his personality. And I think he's basically has this obnoxious personality. So it's hard to even determine what he feels like. Sometimes I think of Trump as this big doofus that's sitting in a dark corner of the White House and just tweeting away by himself. And I don't know that he does much of anything else, but I don't know. I'm kind of rambling about that, but that's I'm sure Winston can give his own views on that.
So I mean, the thing is, like, if you're concerned with sort of the media as an industry and an establishment is like failure to investigate conspiracy theories like the Rich case. I mean, you could look at any number of conspiracies that right-wing internet bloggers and radio show hosts insist that the media should be investigating. For example, that the Newtown massacre was fake, that September 11th was a hoax, that the moon landing was a hoax, that basically every mass shooting is a false flag. Like, if the media like spent the amount of time that like Alex Jones wants the media to spend investigating those things, we would never cover what's actually happening in the government, which people really like need to know about. And so,
Right.
This whole idea that like the media or that the media is like covering things up or failing to investigate things. It's just like, I honestly, like, they just don't, what they do, what happens is like an individual reporter or an editor gets a tip and decides based on, talking to sources or based on his or her own, background knowledge of a subject, or based on the credibility of the person giving the tip, whether it's worthy of investigating. And I can assure you that, like, before, in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, if there was some kind of any reporter in America that gets a tip that could actually lead to some like real story that might damage a politician, either on the left or the right, they're gonna pursue that tip because it's a hyper competitive news environment. So if you break a story about Hillary Clinton, you win. Like, it doesn't matter if you pissed off the progressive base. Like, you all they care about, especially in Washington, is being there first. Is like beating their competitors. They don't care about like only going after one political party or the next. It is certainly true that most individual journalists tend to lean left, but most journalism institutions tend to be owned by
The right.
By the right. So that there's an ongoing tension between the kind of individual practitioners of journalism, the owners of these publications, that just makes it like really untrue to say that the media has it in the tank for liberal candidates or
I don't.
refuses to invest. Yeah.
Well, again, I'm outside the left-right pairing, so there are some of us out here that don't fall into that trap. I don't like Fox News any better than I like CNN. But I'll give you an example from my book Hidden History, and I had tons of these and these were sourced. These were, and you probably might not know about it. You might have been too young for it, and Ella, I'm sure, was too young for it. But back in 1987, there was a guy named R. Bud Dwyer, who was the Pennsylvania state treasurer. And I don't know if you remember this or not. He committed suicide. He shot himself during a live press conference. And it made, the gruesome elements of it made the news. The Washington Post had a front page picture with him sticking the gun in his mouth and so forth. And if I hadn't have already been kind of drawn to what little alternative media there was then, I would have thought it was just another tragedy. Because, and I'm telling you, every single news outlet referred to it in the identical words that they said, after reading a long rambling statement, he shot himself. Well, there was a little newspaper that existed back then, which was, I think, unfairly smeared as an anti-Semitic newspaper called The Spotlight. And that was the only place before the internet where you could get a lot of alternative news. They interviewed R. Bud Dwyer's widow, and she read, and they published the long, rambling statement. Now, again, keep in mind, this was at a press conference. All the networks were there, all the big press, the newspapers, the magazines, the UPI, AP, all that. Not one of them reported what he actually said. He issued, the long rambling statement was a detailed indictment against the then sitting governor of Pennsylvania, who was Richard Thornburg, who went on to become the first Bush's attorney general. And basically he said, this guy is as corrupt as can be, as a state treasurer. He's been using all these for his family, just garden variety corruption. And because R. Bud Dwyer pointed out, hey, you can't do that. You can't use, state funds for your kids and your wife and all that. He retaliated against Dwyer and prosecuted him, came up with bogus charges to try to get him. And this guy, unfortunately, was, I don't know why he was so despondent, but he ended up killing himself. I guess he thought naively that here I'm doing it in front of all the press, this great free press that should be, you talk about a story served up to you on a silver platter, but what happened? Not a single one reported. So I don't, how do you explain? And I'm glad I got to talk to somebody like you, because I don't normally have these kind of contacts to ask, but and again, you may think, I assure you, I'm telling you the truth. You could, if you find the newspaper, you can talk. I don't think his widow's alive, but I communicated with his children, who are still obviously alive, and they know what he actually wrote. And they actually made a film about it. Was at the Cannes Film Festival a few years ago, which kind of restored his reputation a bit. But at the time, and I don't think the media's changed much since '87, they completely covered that up. And these were all competed. They should have wanted to, fight each other for that story. So what would your reaction? That's just one example I use a lot to show how media can cover something up. Like, to me, I think it's reprehensible, and I don't understand why a free press would do that.
Well, let me just say, like, I don't know anything about the Bud Dwyer case. There are certainly if you look at the sort of landscape of media and the history of media, like there are like dozens, hundreds of examples of the media ignoring a story in favor of some establishment figure. I mean, the sad fact of how politics and the media works on both the left and the right is that reporters get tips from sources that they have relationships with, and so if when they develop relationships with a source and get tips based on that, they're pretty reluctant to go and burn that source if they get a tip that their source is doing something bad. And so the way that sort of plays out is that the more established a person is in politics and government and business, the more likely they are to have developed, or at least for members of their team to have developed relationships with individual reporters, and therefore they're just more they're more bulletproof when rumors start to fly about that official being corrupt. I mean, the worst example of the kind of cozy relationship that journalists sometimes have with their sources is September 11th and the lead up to the Iraq War. I mean, Judith Wilson at the New York Times had these sources in the administration who were all telling her, in the Bush administration, who were all telling her Saddam has weapons of mass destruction, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. And because it's so important in the media to get a scoop and to be the first to publish information and to be out front, the Times published story after story after story citing unnamed administration officials suggesting that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction without any real proof. And therefore, and a lot of other institutions followed the Times lead, and before long, everybody in the U.S. just believed it, just believed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, and therefore didn't, call their congresspeople and take to the streets and march to stop the invasion of Iraq, which led to a war that was completely built on false premises and lasted and took the lives of tens of thousands of innocent Iraqi civilians and a whole lot of American soldiers. So like, it's certainly true that journalists often have sort of too cozy a relationship with their sources and are often unwilling to challenge government officials and politicians that they deem individually or deem collectively to be sort of good guys. Like, we had the same thing happen in Oregon, where we had a former governor, Neil Goldschmidt. There had long been rumors back when he was the mayor of Portland that he'd basically raped over a period of years a 15-year-old girl. And the Oregonian, the biggest newspaper in the state, heard those rumors and heard those and got tips about the former governor's behavior, and chose not to investigate it because who knows why? Like, they just didn't deem them credible, or they thought, hey, Neil Goldschmidt's a good guy. Like, there's no way this is true. And then it took Willamette Week, the alternative weekly in Portland, to take up that story and investigate it, to bring those allegations to light. And Willamette Week won a Pulitzer for it. So there are a lot of like oversights and blind spots and failures to investigate people in journalism. To go so far as to call them cover-ups is to suggest that for some reason the media, collude to try to keep information secret when it's right there for them to release. It doesn't really work that way. The way it works is that we just are constantly getting tips, and a lot of the tips we're getting are from people who seem crazy or incredible or politically motivated or whatever, and we might investigate them a little bit and then decide that there's nothing there, and then and maybe we're wrong sometimes. Like, maybe there was something there and we missed it. But I just don't see why. I don't see how I shouldn't say this. Like, I'm sure it's possible for cover-ups to happen. I've never
You don't
been
think
asked
on a large scale. You don't think it.
I've never been asked by an editor or a publisher or anybody in 20 years of doing this to, avoid a story because it might threaten, somebody that was powerful. Like, it's just not the way journalism works by and large.
Well, that's interesting. I talked to another journalist, and he said no one's ever tried to squelch a story. But I guess they said they weren't interested in a story.
I've had editors shoot down a story, and I've definitely felt. I mean, it happens. Sometimes you have a tip about a prominent advertiser to the newspaper, and you'll write the first story, and then the advertiser will call the publisher and complain, and then maybe the second story will be a lot softer, or maybe there'll be a correction written that didn't really need to be written. Like, these kinds of things happen. Like, we live in a corporate oligarchy, and the rich and the powerful have a lot of sway over every system, every institution in society. So when a big, important, powerful, rich person decides that they don't want the rules to apply to them, they often find a way to not have the rules apply to them. And journalism is no,
we see that
exception.
happen time and time again in so many areas. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So what are you working on now?
What am I working on now?
We have about 10 minutes. Yes, I want to put the focus back on you and, see what your projects are and, see what you're working on these days.
Well, one of the things I spend more and more time doing actually is some consulting work, helping like individual entrepreneurs and small businesses tell a better version of their story, which is really fun for me because I get to sort of apply all of the lessons that I learned in journalism to helping like individual people or individual, startups or companies figure out what is really the soul of their story and how to tell it. Because what you learn is like the story is powerful. Like there's no more kind of powerful, engaging, captivating, tool that we have in society apart from storytelling. And so when people are good at telling a story, they tend to be really effective at everything they do, at selling things, in romance and in any part of life, like, because people are listening to you if you're telling a good story. And so it's been fun to kind of take the concept of story and apply it in some other areas. I'm also working on a couple of longer form pieces right now, one of which is about a woman in Venezuela named Maria Fernanda de Giacobbe, who is a chocolatier, and she has, when she kind of transitioned away from her family business, which was all these cafes scattered around Caracas, into the chocolate business, into bonbon making, she realized that there were all these cacao trees growing on people's land that had just been left to rot after the oil boom that struck Venezuela back in the 50s and before, and people who had been growing cacao successfully and been sort of individual farmers all gave it up to try to get rich in fossil fuels. Now it still had these trees on their property, and Venezuela grows great cacao and very kind of unique varieties of the plant. And so she took it upon herself to start reaching out to some of these people whose incomes and liabilities and job prospects have since collapsed, as with the fall of oil prices, and has convinced many of them to go back into farming cacao and taking better care of those plants, and making basically chocolate. And she's set up a couple of institutions that train women to grow cacao and to make chocolate, and she's hundreds and hundreds of women have started their own little businesses and shops in an economy that's just ravaged. That's one of the worst in the world at this point. And so that's one of the things I'm working on right now.
Well, that's very fascinating. Very fascinating.
Yeah, she's a great lady.
Huh. Do you get a chance to travel a lot? Do you go internationally for stories sometimes?
I travel a lot internationally, and then what I tend to do is sort of try to find stories when I'm there. I don't really
makes sense.
I don't very often get to go somewhere just for a story. But in the last couple of years, I've been traveling a lot internationally just because as a freelancer, you can, right? You're not held down to living in one place and working some job or some particular beat. So I could just, when I first became a full-time freelancer, I got a fellowship in Vienna, and then stayed in Europe and lived and just wrote a bunch of stories all over Europe for the next 9 months. And that's when I got hired at NEWSWEEK, actually, and became the magazine's Europe correspondent for about 6 months before they transferred me back home, just needing more help domestically. So, I love to travel. I love to find interesting stories when I'm there, and I do it as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's enjoyable. It sounds like it. Where's some of your favorite places? We still have a few minutes, so I thought I would ask you.
I would say, I mean, I really love Europe. Europe is getting super crowded with tourists. I think I read recently that a third of all international travel destinations are in Europe now. And so there are a lot of places in Europe that are just bombarded and like not worth visiting unless something happens that causes them to die down quite a bit. But I love a lot of I love Spain. I really like Amsterdam, Vienna are a few of my favorite cities. I'd also like to see a lot more of Latin America. Last winter I was in Patagonia on both the Chilean and Argentinian side, and they're just like stunning places. I'd really like to do more kind of outdoors oriented travel, like hiking in places like New Zealand. I've never been on that continent at all.
It's a good one to go to. I hear it's beautiful. Incredible. I haven't been there either.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that there's something everywhere, worth seeing. I try to stay away from the tourist traps, even if it's like a seventh wonder of the world. There's just going to be way too many people there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can travel to some places that are not busy year round. Like the summer is not. Well, in Europe, like of course it's inundated with American tourists right now. But I think like in May or something is a good time to go there. I'm not sure, but yeah, you just have to kind of check and see when they get the most tourism from what country. It's kind of a dance.
That's true. Going in the off season can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Well, I've really, really enjoyed speaking with you. This has been fascinating to me, and to hear your perspective. I learned from you during this interview. Because I'm always like, I'm a big fan of journalists, but I'm also a big fan of alternative media, which sometimes those two seem to be opposing. And so I really enjoyed listening to your point of view and to listening to your stories and your life. And Donald, I really enjoyed it. We're out. Can you want to go ahead and give any way to reach you, like website or where they can see your work? Where can people read your work?
I mean, in general, you can just Google me at Winston Ross and find all kinds of stuff. But one good place to check out some of what I do is at Better.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
You'll find some interesting stuff there.
Okay, well, thank you. And Donald, thank you so much for co-hosting with me again. And
Revolution Radio.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.